Thank you. And now we have Chris Lubinski. He is a professor of education policy at Indiana University, author of many articles, but with his wife, he has authored The Public School Advantage.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction and for inviting me here. I think the reasons I'm here providing your lunchtime entertainment have to do with the fact that I've, for the better part of 2 decades now, I've been focused on public and private interest in education in areas such as organizational behavior and effects in different types of schools. So vouchers are a part of that, although it's a much larger research agenda than just vouchers. And also more recently, for most of the last decade, I've been working with a couple of colleagues on a study about how research use is shaped by advocacy networks for policymaking. And so I'll bring that to bear a little bit later in my talk. But just what I'd like to do here is give you a really brief history of the research and advocacy around school vouchers, including some of the recent developments that Brian just mentioned. And mention, I'm not going to go into detail, but just mention some of the potential explanations for the recent shifts we're seeing in the outcomes. And the takeaways that we can that are important from voucher advocacy. And as this is about zombie education reform, the question being why we have this continued popularity of these types of policies, I'll be drawing on this more recent study that I've done with Liz DeBray at Georgia and Janelle Scott at Berkeley, funded by the William T. Grant Foundation on advocacy networks. So as many of you know, the modern version of vouchers in America started really in 1990 in Milwaukee. There was a previous experiment in California, but most people don't put much weight on that one. But in Milwaukee, the legislature passed some authorizing legislation and required an evaluation component for that. And for the first several years, that evaluation was coming back and finding really no effects from vouchers for students using vouchers. But then another group of people did a secondary analysis of that research using a randomized approach, and they argued that there were, in fact, significant impacts for students using vouchers. There was a similar back and forth in the data for the Cleveland voucher program, which was the one that eventually went to the Supreme Court, although that one wasn't randomized. And if you follow this, there's been a number of cities over the years that have been studied. Washington, D.C. certainly, New York City, Dayton, Ohio, Charlotte. And there, I don't want to get too far into the methodology here, but there was typically randomized controlled trial approaches to studying the results there. And the benefits, if there were any, were modest at best and largely inconsistent. Voucher advocates compared them to gains from class size reduction, which they argued vouchers are much cheaper than class size reduction, so they're a better policy alternative. And they lauded the potential of school vouchers to eventually close achievement gaps. Independent researchers were a bit less convinced. Cecilia Rouse in 2009, for example, argued the best research to date finds relatively small achievement gains for students offered vouchers, most of which are not statistically different from zero. Eppel and Romano, in a more recent 2015 systematic review of the economics literature, said the empirical research on small-scale programs does not suggest that awarding students a voucher is a systematically reliable way to improve educational outcomes. Nonetheless, voucher advocates such as Education Choice, or Ed Choice, which was previously the Friedman Foundation, they held up a number of voucher studies as proof that vouchers work. And some, in fact, argued that there was a hidden consensus based on randomized controlled trials showing that the learning gains were pretty consistent across studies. In fact, even those claims were contested. And most people would agree that any kind of benefits tended to be rather haphazard. They'd show up for one population at one grade level in one city, but not in other cities, for example. So there's 2 takeaways that I want to point out here. 2 standards in a way. One is the centrality of test scores. Whether you like them or not, they've been baked into federal and state education policy since No Child Left Behind. But voucher advocacy has focused on test scores even before that. Going into the 1990s, that had become the measure by which they were judging the success of those programs. And the second one is the question of doing no harm. Voucher advocates such as Jay Green or Carolyn Hawksby argued that even if we don't accept their conclusion that vouchers are showing benefits, at least they've not shown it to cause any harm to students. Now, as you might know, since 2015, there's been quite a sea change in the findings. Statewide studies in Louisiana, Indiana, and Ohio have found large negative impacts for students using vouchers. There's been a new series of studies here in DC. The first 2 years found substantial negative impacts. The third year was pretty much a wash. The Center for American Progress argued that those detrimental impacts were worse than other negative in-school factors such as violent crime at school, high teacher turnover, and teacher absenteeism, and vouchers are worse than smoking, according to the Center for American Progress. But the big point here is that, thinking back to the tables Brian showed, there's that blue line there, and above the blue line, which is basically 2015, most studies find large negative impacts on learning for students. And interestingly enough, those negative impacts tend to be more pronounced in mathematics, and some researchers argue that mathematics is a better indicator of school effects because mathematics is mostly learned in school, where things like reading are often taught at home as well. So that I think is interesting. In no studies were there any positive effects on academic gains since 2015. So certainly that raises questions about, well, why are we seeing these shifts? And there's been a number of ideas that have been held out. Some are speculation, some have been tested. Certainly the question of mobility and transition, as students leave a public school for a private school with a voucher, does that cause disruption in their learning? Are they attending worse private schools? Is there the over-regulation thesis, which I think Betsy DeVos has adopted, that too much regulation scares away the better performing private schools from participating in voucher programs? Students may be exiting from better public schools. More instructional time in public schools. There's some indication that might be the case. Or that private schools lack experience with programs or assessment required in the voucher programs. And so they're adopting to a new kind of regulatory environment. I would point out that some of these explanations have been tested and make sense in one context, for example, in Louisiana, but not in another, for example, Indiana. So we don't have a consistent explanation at this point for why we're seeing this sudden sea change in the voucher outcomes. One thing that I suspect is that moving from small city-based programs to larger state-based programs removes some of the school level selection bias that's at play in more urban centers. So again, thinking back to the tables Brian put up, every study above the blue line was large statewide voucher programs, with the exception of DC. All the ones below that blue line tended to be smaller city-based programs, and so that might have an impact. There's much research indicating that private schools aren't, on average, more effective, and indeed, in some cases, the opposite than public schools. So when we scaled up these statewide programs, we're accessing more representative samples of public and private schools. And while randomized control trials have advantages, for example, greater internal validity, the external validity raises questions when you scale up those programs. So what may have worked or not in Dayton, Ohio doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work for all of Ohio when you scale up those programs. But another issue with randomized control trials is they don't necessarily capture the peer effects at different types of schools. If students are leaving from a poor public school for a more affluent private school, for example, that's not necessarily captured in the research design. So the peer effect can be diluted as you expand these programs. You run out of more academically oriented peers as you have more people go into voucher programs and they go to a wider set of schools. And we know that public schools may have become more responsive to certain reforms. For example, in mathematics, the NCTM-based reforms, and some of the accountability regimes. They do, in fact, have more experience since No Child Left Behind with paying attention to those types of regimes with our test score based. And it could be that private schools just aren't necessarily that great, which really undercuts some of the theory behind vouchers, such as from James Coleman's earlier work on the private school effect, or Chubb and Moe's work. Regardless, the response of voucher advocates to these negative findings helps to address the question that we're looking at today. What makes for zombie policies that survive despite evidence that would seemingly drive a stake through them? And I think that's going with Paul Krugman's description of voodoo economics. One important factor is these policies are very commonsensical. They really appeal to a very simple idea about how education should work. Fit on a bumper sticker. They're often advanced by anecdotes about a student who was able to leave a a failing public school and go to a better private school through a voucher program, for example. We also, in a lot of areas, we think that markets work, so why not in terms of education? That has an appeal to it, although it starts to become more problematic when you start to look at the causal chains which work through the types of impositions of market mechanisms on education. Another issue is the constituencies. David Tyack, the historian, for example, with Larry Cuban, looked at which types of education reforms succeed, not in terms of doing what they were purported to do, but in terms of surviving, and argued that having a constituency, a group of people that ascribe to a certain program, is an important factor in the longevity of a reform. But there's two factors that I want to focus on here, one being the ideological coherence and the other one what I call empirical fluidity. The ideological coherence is evident in policy advocacy networks, and here I'll point to the work I've done with Liz DeBray and Janelle Scott. And in terms of empirical fluidity, the ability to move the goalposts through the media, what we call strategic dissembling, as the facts on the ground change. So first, in terms of ideological coherence, in 2008, in a New York Times piece titled "How Many Billionaires Does It Take to Fix a School System?" Rick Hess from the AEI said, the school choice community has been very effective in policy advocacy. In Wisconsin, the Bradley and Olin Foundations were instrumental in getting the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program passed. They were then instrumental in providing political air cover for the program. They found and supported researchers to document it, and they helped promote it nationally. So this establishes some of the players that we are seeing in terms of voucher advocacy, things like philanthropies that have been very instrumental, certain policy-making networks, and researchers. And in terms of the playbook for those players, the recent work from Christopher Leonard Copeland discusses the echo chambers created by the Koch brothers and Americans for Prosperity. Talks quite a bit about how they commissioned reports, seek media influence, and then pressure policymakers, often through grass tops campaigns. And for what it's worth, those tactics are very similar to what we're seeing in policy advocacy around vouchers. And again, for what it's worth, maybe nothing, but some of the funders are the same between climate denialists and some of the voucher advocacy organizations. In terms of research reports, I want to be clear, I'm not questioning the integrity of any researchers or suggesting that they're manipulating findings, but we're increasingly seeing a blurring of the boundaries between research and advocacy. Brookings was an early think tank here in DC that was behind school choice. But more recently, we're seeing EdChoice, which I said was the Friedman Foundation, the Reason Foundation, Heritage, Heartland, Cato Institute. And they've been very active in collecting and promoting favorable evidence and explaining away research that's not supporting a voucher agenda. And in terms of media influence, advocacy organizations are much more adept at getting traction with media than are a lot of researchers, frankly. And specific media outlets are very active in debates around school vouchers, for example. The Wall Street Journal editorial page has a very pronounced position, Washington Examiner, but also some of the newer media outlets like the 74, Choice Media, or Redefined Online are also media outlets through which a lot of this is advanced. And I can't discount social media as well. We see a lot of trolling going on there around these debates. And in terms of political influence, groups like, since many of these programs are state-based, groups like ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, is very instrumental. Students First, which is associated with Betsy DeVos, and in the course, the Institute for Justice, are all some of the political players that have direct lines to the policymakers. And then secondly, why there is ideological coherence, these groups are also adept at pivoting in the face of new empirical evidence. I should point out, for some, vouchers were never really about greater effectiveness. Milton Friedman, if you go back to 1955, it was about freedom to choose. Many people have been interested in vouchers because they undercut, a public sector institution. Even in 1958, Virgil Bloom was arguing that Catholic schools should get a subsidy as just a way to advance choice. So they weren't really particularly focused on school effectiveness. However, I think it's pretty indisputable that modern discussions of vouchers were all about test scores, at least until 2015. Although other factors were considered as well. Test scores were, like I mentioned, a central part of the debate. By far the most frequent measure of success in a lot of the reports on school vouchers. And some people built careers arguing that there was a hidden consensus and that vouchers worked in terms of boosting test scores. And now they argue that, or I'm sorry, then they also argued, as I said, that vouchers do no harm. But now some of those same people are moving the goalposts and writing articles like, do impacts on test scores even matter? Or, if you mostly care about test scores, private school choice is not for you. In fact, there appears to be a new consensus emerging that vouchers are indeed harming students in terms of learning, and these are standards that have been set out by voucher advocates themselves in the past. So in conclusion, this raises some interesting questions, not just about consistency. What is the evidence of the relationship between test scores and other outcomes? And there's an article in your packet that looks at that issue. Are there better indicators for parents and for policymakers to use in evaluating programs? And what trade-offs are we willing to accept if we're seeing vouchers causing lower test scores? Are lower levels of achievement appropriate if we're seeing higher levels of parent satisfaction? Is that an appropriate trade-off? Or loss of learning but more high school graduation and college enrollment? Which is an interesting question when you think about it in terms of this era of student debt. And is choice a sufficient policy goal in and of itself, or is there a responsibility to parents and taxpayers to make sure students are getting a better education through these programs, or at least not harmed by them? So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Chris. Let me remind you that if you have any questions, please write your questions on the index cards. Does everybody have index cards? Okay, please write your questions on your index card.